Howdy folks, my name is Saoirse the Vixen and welcome back to Microsoft Flight Simulator. I do want to start out by apologizing for my delay. As of late, my work schedule has been absolutely insane and I've been very busy, but I'm so very excited to finally share this episode with you guys. Today we're going to be taking a look at what I consider to be the most beautiful airplane ever designed. It was a joint venture between France and Great Britain, and it was the first and most successful supersonic passenger airliner. It could cruise at a blistering Mach 2 at 60,000 feet. It was a marvel of innovation, the perfect marriage of technology and engineering. This, and I apologize for my awful French, is the Aerospace British Aerospace Corporation, or BAC, Concorde. I have always been in love with this particular airplane and I relish the opportunity to share it with you guys. We're going to be recreating the first ever passenger flight of this airplane from Paris to New York with Air France Flight 001. It's November 22nd, 1977, and we're here at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, France at gate A18. It's 10:45 a.m. and we push back in 15 minutes, so let's get on board and check out this magnificent, complicated airplane.
Pourrions de ranger votre valise cabine dans les coffres. Seuls les accessoires et les bagages de petit format doivent être placés sous le siège devant.
And welcome aboard. So as you can see by looking at this rather complicated instrument panel that the Concorde was a very complex airplane even for its time. Not only because of what was required to make sure the airplane stayed in balance and could fly as fast as it did, but also because it was it was the first commercial airplane to use a fly-by-wire system. Now granted, this one was an analog system, but it was still a fly-by-wire system, which was required because of how the airplane was designed and what needed to happen to keep the airplane flying as fast as it was. The flight crew certainly had their hands full, especially during takeoff and landing, because of the higher angle of attack required to maintain lift and the higher speed necessary to make the airplane fly. Now, that being said, the airplane was still considered to be a dream to fly. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get our passengers on board. We're going to get this airplane started and get back from the gate and start our trip out to New York. So let's go ahead and get everything started. Let's get out of here, and don't forget your champagne.
Okay, cleared for push start. Please release parking brake.
Parking brakes are released.
Commencing pushback. You can start the engines in sequence.
Yeah, we'll start in the sequence.
Pushback completed. Please set your parking brake.
Parking brake set.
Parking brake set. Lowering aircraft.
Ground. You may disconnect.
Okay, sir. Clear to disconnect. Pin has been removed. See you at the side. Have a good flight.
Holding position waiting for the visual. Thank you and goodbye.
So while we get this thing taxied to the runway, let's talk a little bit about the design of this airplane. Now, obviously, Concorde had a very unusual design, a radical departure from what we would normally consider to be a regular airplane. And that was necessary for the very high speeds that it was expected to achieve. The delta wing and the tailless design actually meant that the airplane was not generating lift on the ground at all until rotation. This is why the landing gear is as tall as it is and why the airplane sits so high off the ground, because the angle of attack had to be almost 18 degrees in order for the airplane to actually fly. The landing gear was actually so tall that it had to telescope whenever it was being retracted. Because of the high speeds necessary for both takeoff and landing, this airplane also used the first instance of carbon-based brakes, which was not only necessary for the high speeds, but also for the weight saving, which was they had to save weight everywhere they could with this thing to make it go as fast as it was. Now, one interesting bit about this airplane that you probably saw just before we started was the drooping nose. In order for the airplane to go as fast as it did, it needed to have a long and straight nose in order to achieve Mach 2, but obviously that long nose was going to limit your visibility at the high angle of attack needed to keep the airplane flying. So, in order to increase visibility on taxi, takeoff, and landing, the nose could lower. 5 degrees for takeoff and for taxi, and 12.5 degrees for landing. The visor that you saw sliding down when the nose was retracting was also there in order to keep the cockpit cool, because the nose of the airplane got exceedingly hot while it was flying at Mach 2, but also to ensure that the wind would be as streamlined as possible going over the fuselage. Now, obviously, an airplane as unique as the Concorde required a unique takeoff procedure as well. That was primarily for noise abatement, if you can believe it. This airplane's defining feature, or rather 4 of its defining features, were its 4 Rolls-Royce Snecma Olympus 593 turbojet engines. These things had reheat, or afterburner as we would commonly call it, which it used during takeoff and during the transonic portion of the flight when it was breaking the sound barrier. Obviously, these engines are extremely loud. And so in order to keep people happy on the ground around these airports with these things, the takeoff procedure went as follows. The pilot would cue up the reheat using the piano switches behind the throttle quadrant, 1, 2, 3, 4. He would turn them all on. Once the airplane was lined up and ready to go on the runway, the captain and first officer would confer. They'd make sure everything was set, the airplane was ready to go. Then the captain would announce 3, 2, 1, now. On now, the throttles would be advanced all the way forward and a timer would be started. After 60 seconds, which is the time that was roughly factored in to get the airplane to 250 knots and climbing away steadily, the reheat would be turned off and the climb would proceed as normal. The airplane's rotation speed was over 170 knots and she would fly over 200, so a very, very, very fast takeoff roll compared to what you would normally see in any kind of airliner. These engines produced 38,000 pounds of thrust apiece during reheat. They also had the ability to supercruise, which means that they could accelerate and maintain Mach 2 without using the afterburners. These engines were incredibly fuel efficient when flying at Mach 2, but not so on the ground. Just the taxi from the gate to the runway alone burned over 4,000 pounds of fuel, which is an insane amount when you consider how much the airplane actually carried with it. All right, everything looks good. Everything's set. I think we're ready to get out of here. So, well, I guess count it down with me. 3, 2, 1, now. So now that we're successfully climbing away from Paris, the flight engineer would now begin a fuel transfer in order to shift the airplane's center of gravity. Because of the nature of how the airplane flew and the fact that it needed to go as fast as it did, a perfect balance needed to be maintained at all times. As the aircraft approached the Mach barrier, the center of pressure, or basically the lift point of the airplane, would shift farther aft. The design of the airplane was as such to prevent this from happening, but it still would shift as much as 2 meters as the airplane accelerated past the sound barrier. Now, if the center of gravity for the airplane stayed in the same place, the nose would begin to pitch down as that center of pressure moved back. This could normally be adjusted with trim tabs, but any kind of protrusions into the airstream would drastically slow the airplane down with immense amounts of drag, or just rip them off entirely. So in order to keep the airplane as streamlined as possible, the Concorde used a revolutionary, at least for passenger airliners, fuel transfer system. Fuel could be transferred from the 2 forward tank, number 9 and number 10, all the way back to the aft transfer tank or trim tank in tank number 11. Inlets would be open on tank 11, pumps would be started on 9 and 10, and fuel would be transferred to the back of the airplane to shift the center of gravity. On the other end of the flight, as the airplane was slowing down, the reverse would happen. They would move fuel from tank 11, which is the aft tank, forward to tanks 9 and 10. Fuel could also be transferred to other tanks inside the airplane, of which there's 11 of them in total, and from right to left and left to right in general, to keep the airplane perfectly balanced as it was flying. The flight engineer had a very, very, very precise job, and most all of them did it with stunning accuracy. Now that we're cruising towards New York at a blistering Mach 2, let's talk a little bit about the history of this fantastic airplane. Admittedly, this is going to be a bit of an abbreviated history because I'm not as much of a historian as I like to pretend I am on the internet. I would highly recommend looking at a vast number of resources and learn as much about this airplane as you possibly can, because it is a fantastic story and a miracle the airplane ever got made in the first place. Not only because of the amount of research needed to find out what designs and what would work best for a supersonic transport, but also because you had two countries coming together to form a core common goal, which wasn't really a common thing back in that day and age, especially after the war. In the early 50s, there were a handful of studies already being proposed to look at the feasibility of a supersonic transport. It was considered to be the next logical step for passenger travel. The sound barrier had already been broken. I mean, where else are you going to go? You're going to make bigger and bigger jets? No, you want to go as fast as possible. And so that is what the British government wanted to look into. And so after a decade of research in 1960, the British government essentially authorized the use of government funds for the British Aerospace Corporation, or BAC, which was newly formed, to begin the design of a supersonic transport. At the same time, the French corporation Sud Aviation, or what would become Aerospace, was also developing a supersonic transport of their own. When the two companies came together to essentially trade notes and discuss the possibility of a merger, they realized that they were actually all on the same page. The French even admitted that they would likely be using British engines anyway for their particular design. So a contract was drawn up, a treaty was proposed to the French and British governments, and after much haranguing and a little bit of treachery by the French President Charles de Gaulle, the treaty was signed in 1963, and the two countries began working together to create this airplane. As a nod to this coming together, this working together by these two corporations, by these two countries, the name Concorde was selected. Concord in French, Concorde in English, which essentially means a coming together, a harmony, which was an apt naming convention, I would imagine. The design phase of this airplane moved very quickly because once the two countries came together to form this treaty, this partnership, the United States did the exact same thing when John F. Kennedy authorized the use of government funds to create an American supersonic transport, which Boeing was doing with their 707 design, which was remarkably similar to what the French and the British were already putting together. Most of these companies were all on the same page. Now, the American design was a much bigger and much faster design, because the Americans wanted to use titanium, whereas the English and the French were using aluminum at the time, which is why the airplane's top speed was only Mach 2, because that's the best the aluminum could do at the time. The assumption was that the Concorde was going to be a very successful airplane because the notion, again, was that supersonic transport was going to be the name of the game. This was back when science fiction was, well, science fiction. And that's where the market was assumed to go. And had it not been for the socio-political and geopolitical and socio-economical hardships of the 70s, as well as the oil crisis, that might have been the case. But sadly, it did not turn out to be. But that's obviously a story for a different time. I'm not a politician or a political historian, but most of us know, at least the older of us know, what the fallout for that particular era of the world was. Concorde began its testing in the late 60s. And in 1965, the first prototype, 001, rolled off of the line. Design and testing for prototype 001 would continue through the 60s all the way to 1969, which is when its first flight would take place. In October of that same year, it would go supersonic for the first time. By now, there were 3 distinct programs being run to create a supersonic passenger airliner. Concorde here, Tupolev's Tu-144, and Boeing's 707 concept. In 1971, the U.S. government would halt funding for the American SST, and the 2707 would go the way of the Dodo, which left only two, Tupolev and Concorde in this case here. Now, an airshow crash of the Tupolev Tu-144 would seriously hamper its development, and the airplane would only make 56 passenger flights in total before it would be completely shuttered at once, leaving Concorde as the only passenger airliner that could go twice the speed of sound. One final note, at least about the production of the airplane, was that the actual total estimate of the aircraft was 70 million pounds, or just a shade over almost 1.4 billion pounds if you consider what today's money would be. But actually, the airplane would end up costing 2.1 billion pounds, or if my notes are correct here, 13.2 billion pounds in today's money, which is an insane amount of money. And most all of it, in fact, I think all of it, if I think about it, was at government expense. And the airplane in no way recouped any of that during its lifetime. After a solar eclipse mission in 1973, scheduled passenger service on Concorde began on January 21st, 1976, with British Airways flying the airplane from London to Bahrain and Air France flying the airplane from Paris to Rio de Janeiro. There were 16 airplanes in service despite a litany of orders, and only two airlines ever actually flew the airplane, British Airways and Air France, with Air Singapore, or Singapore Airlines, being in the mix for just a little while before flights over to Singapore got too expensive. Flights to the United States would actually not begin until the 24th of May 1976, with the airplane flying into Dulles in Washington, D.C. from Paris and from London. Now, the ever popular and the famous New York leg actually had to wait until 1977 because local ordinances actually banned the airliner or the airplane in New York until 1977 because of concerns about noise and environmental concerns, which in the end were basically unfounded because it was discovered, at least after the fact, that the 707 was actually louder than the Concorde was, which, if you can believe it, was a very interesting tidbit I learned. In 1977, November 22nd, was the first time the Concorde could fly into New York, and that is what we're doing today. Eventually, the New York to London and New York to Paris routes would be the only ones that were ever being run because the airplane was too cost prohibitive to operate for any length of time for any other runs, despite the fact that they would have liked to operate elsewhere. Most of you who are from where I'm from, Dallas-Fort Worth, knew that the Concorde would fly into DFW for a time, up until I believe the early 80s, or the late 70s, early 80s, if I recall correctly, through Braniff Airways, which was a very odd choice if you consider what was going on at the time. Braniff crews would fly the airplane from Dallas-Fort Worth to Washington, D.C., where a British Airways crew would take the airplane the rest of the way to London. The airplane would never go supersonic over the United States, but it would still travel much faster than a contemporary airliner of the day. One interesting note about the airplane was that despite the fact that the service aboard was considered first class with champagne and with a very premier, the Concorde lounges, so to speak, in France, Great Britain, and New York, the airplane actually wasn't very comfortable. The fuselage had to be very narrow in order to facilitate the speeds the airplane was flying at, so it only could seat 4 abreast in a very cramped cockpit. The true allure of the airplane was the speed at which it was traveling. If you compare what the airplane had versus, say, a first-class seat or a first-class ticket or even a first-class accommodations of any kind today, it was severely lacking. But Concorde passengers got their own luggage tags, which I'm going to show you a picture of right here because my mother actually has one, if you can believe it. And then obviously the speed was certainly a factor. Concorde would have a long and, if you ask some people, prosperous career up until 2003. There was only one incident with the airplane. That was in the year 2000 with Air France Flight 459 790, which it crashed on takeoff from Charles de Gaulle after blowing a tire during its takeoff roll. The September 11th attacks and the incident in question certainly contributed to the loss of passenger revenue, and finally in 2003, the airliner was retired for good. All of them, except for the one that was lost, are now on display, and I would highly recommend going out and taking a look at them if you ever get a chance. It is an experience like no other. Well, folks, welcome to New York, and thank you so much for joining me on today's flight of Air France 001 from Paris to JFK. I had an absolute blast with this airplane. It was truly a wonderful experience, and I'm so glad I had a chance to share it with you guys, so thank you so much for joining me. If you do enjoy what I do, please like and subscribe. I'm going to do my best to try to be a little more consistent with my uploads, but my work schedule being what it is, I can't really promise that. So I appreciate your patience. Thank you so much for sticking with me. And, well, leave a comment down below if you enjoyed this. I had an absolute blast making this video, and I hope that you had a good time too. I would also recommend checking out as many resources as possible about the airplane, because I believe that it's got the most fascinating history of any passenger airliner ever built. So, I guess that's all there is to it. Let's head into the Concorde Lounge, have ourselves a drink, and then continue on with our journey. My name is Saoirse the Vixen. Thank you so much for joining me today. I will see you guys in the next one.